Lecture 4, Southern Resident Orcas, Salish Sea, Dialects as Identity. On summer days along the west side of San Juan Island, the ocean tells you who is coming before the dorsal fins clear the horizon. Stand on the basalt ledge at Lime Kill Point when the flood tide pushes north and the current stacks into pale green rips. The surface looks chaotic, whitecaps, kelp streamers, the occasional guillemot, but the hydrophone line that runs out from the lighthouse is calm, a cable into another world. In your headphones you get a repeating shape, a pulsed call that rises, falls, then snaps off in just under a second, energy concentrated in a band a few thousand hertz wide, often produced in pairs with a crisp half-second gap. A few minutes later you hear the same contour again, but shorter, breathier, pitch shifted just enough that it sounds like someone trying to sing along and missing the note by a small, consistent margin. That is likely a calf making its first attempts at the family badge, and the adults repeating the correct version at full volume. When the black fins finally slide past the point in a tight line, 2 to 3 body lengths apart, the choreography matches the tape. J-pod, the most frequently seen of the southern resident killer whales that use this strait as a summer corridor. You can recognize them now the way you recognize an accent in a train station, by sound before sight. The difference between noise and dialect is about 30 years of work, a handful of hydrophones, and an argument about whether whales have culture that started in bureaucratic offices and ended with conservation law. For coast Salish peoples around the Salish Sea, those voices never needed translation to be real. Oral histories from nations such as the Lummi and Slyer-Waututh describe Kiwihulmeshan, killer whales, as organized in enduring family groups with distinct ways of speaking, stories recorded long before any spectrogram glowed on a lab wall. In those stories, orcas respond to drumbeats, appear reliably in certain seasons, and carry obligations and respect like any other powerful neighbor. Western science, arriving late and with more guns than hydrophones, spent most of the 20th century treating them as dangerous vermin or mobile fish competitors. Through the 1950s and 1960s, U.S. Navy hydrophone arrays and marine park collectors recorded orca calls incidentally, howls and squeals archived on tape with the rest of the oceanic noise. But nobody could say which sounds belonged to which group because orca society existed mainly as fishermen's grumbling about wolves of the sea. That mismatch, local knowledge of stable families versus official ignorance of even basic head counts, set the stage for the first real census, which began for all the wrong reasons and produced all the right data. The wrong reasons were aquariums. Between 1965 and 1975, live capture operations in the Salish Sea and nearby inlets removed roughly 4 to 7 killer whales for exhibition, most of them young southern residents. Several more died in the process. Pen Cove on Whidbey Island became notorious after a 1970 capture where helicopters, speedboats, and explosives were used to corral a group, and carcasses were allegedly sunk to hide the death toll. By the mid-1970s, public unease and lawsuits forced Washington state to ask what should have been an obvious question decades earlier: how many whales are actually left? The state game department contracted Canadian biologist Michael Bigg to find out. Bigg's solution in 1973 was deceptively simple and scientifically brutal. Instead of guessing from occasional counts, he took high-contrast photographs of every dorsal fin and saddle patch he could find, cataloging nicks, shapes, and pigmentation like fingerprints, then cross-matching individuals across years. If you could still find the same fin with the same scars season after season, you were dealing with a relatively small, closed population, not a constant stream of anonymous migrants. His tally for the southern residents, about 70 whales, organized into 3 pods that traveled separately but repeatedly in the same areas, landed like a dropped wrench. The limitless killer whales of regional myth turned out to be 3 extended families, later labeled J, K, and L pods, with mothers, grandmothers, and offspring that rarely separated. Bigg's work did 2 things that matter for culture. First, it established that these whales live in strict matrilines, offspring of both sexes stay with their mothers for life, and older females may lead pods for 50 or more years. Second, it gave other scientists a roster of known individuals to attach behaviors to. When you know that the tall, ragged dorsal fin in your photograph matches J1, Ruffles, and the small, smooth fin beside him is J2, Granny, and you see them together in 1976, 1983, 1992, you stop treating a call on tape as a killer whale sound and start treating it as something this particular family does. From the mid-1970s onward, Ken Balcom's Center for Whale Research on San Juan Island took that approach and never let go. Balcom launched the Orca Survey in 1976 and, with a staff of a few hardy biologists and many volunteer eyes, turned nearly every summer presence of southern residents in Harrow Strait into data. photo ID, group composition, births, deaths, behavior notes, and later, matching acoustic recordings. By the 1990s, virtually every whale had a catalogue number and nickname, and the life histories of individuals, who stranded, who disappeared, who turned up with a new calf, were tracked as closely as human residents in a small town. While Balcombe and Big were counting fins, John K. B. Ford was listening. In the late 1970s, he set up camp at Johnston Strait, a narrow, fjord-like passage off northeastern Vancouver Island where northern resident killer whales predictably gathered in summer. With a small boat, a reel-to-reel recorder, and hydrophones lowered into glassy inlets, he documented that different northern resident groups used distinct sets of repeated pulsed calls. That one family liked certain complex, multisyllable calls, while another preferred a slightly different pattern. The calls were stereotyped enough that you could recognize a group by ear the way you recognize a familiar song on the radio after a single bar. That was the first serious hint that killer whales might have vocal dialects. Ford then did the obvious and difficult next step. He brought the method south. Using Biggs and Balcombe's visual IDs to know which pod he was recording in the Salish Sea, he built call catalogues for J, K, and L pods through the early 1980s. Each pod, it turned out, used a stable set of around a dozen discrete pulsed calls that they shared among themselves and rarely, if ever, with the other pods, nested inside a community-wide repertoire of perhaps 30 call types. Some calls were common currency across pods, others were pod exclusives. The pattern mirrored family trees, not geography. To test whether these differences mattered to the whales, Ford and colleagues ran one of the only playback experiments anyone has dared do on these animals. In the early 1980s, they broadcast recordings of mammal hunting, transient, killer whales, now called Biggs killer whales, to fish-eating residents at a distance and watched what happened. The residents, who normally ignored boat noise and seemed unbothered by most playback, changed course and showed agitation, as if avoiding something dangerous. When familiar resident calls were played instead, they were more likely to approach. You do not need to impute words to see the function. The whales can discriminate between us and not us by sound alone, and they respond accordingly. Decades later, long-term analyses would confirm that southern residents share no social calls with their northern resident cousins despite overlapping ranges and similar salmon diets, while closely related pods within the southern resident community share more calls with each other than with more distant pods. The dialect boundaries line up with maternal genealogies, not with water temperature, depth, or shoreline shape, exactly what you would expect if calves learn how to speak whale from their mothers and grandmothers rather than from the rocks. All of that is past tense, the present is less tidy. Historically there were on the order of 100 southern residents in the 1960s before capture operations hollowed the population to 71 by 1974. After captures ended, the whales rebounded to 97 by 1996, a peak that looked reassuring until the bottom fell out again. By the early 2020s, official counts hovered in the mid-70s. One NOAA 5-year review put the total at 72 in 2020, and the Center for Whale Research reported 73 to 75 individuals around 2022, depending on calf survival that year. Today, 3 pods remain, J, K, and L, each with a few dozen or fewer whales, their membership tracked so closely that every birth and death reverberates through NGO press releases and agency reports. These are not herds of whales in the abstract. They are small, named societies whose total membership could fit into a middle school auditorium with seats to spare. The pressures squeezing those numbers are simple to list and vicious to quantify. Prey limitation comes first. These whales are cultural salmon specialists. Cascadia Research and NOAA diet studies using fish scale and fecal DNA analyses show that 80% or more of their annual calories traditionally come from Chinook salmon, the largest and fattiest Pacific salmon species. Chinook runs on the Fraser and Columbia River systems, and on smaller coastal rivers, have been hammered by dams, habitat loss, overfishing, and now marine heat waves. The Center for Whale Research has put ballpark numbers on the whale's needs, roughly 500,000 adult Chinook per year to keep the population roughly stable, and on the order of 1 million annually to allow growth to about 140 whales. Those numbers are uncomfortable on purpose. They translate charismatic megafauna into the same units used in fisheries meetings. A pod spread over a kilometer of tide rip cannot afford to improvise a new diet every generation. The calves learn that Chinook is dinner because their mothers provision them with Chinook, not because the species comes pre-installed in their genes. Pollution adds a long-term booby trap. Decades of PCB, DDT, and flame retardant use left persistent organic pollutants in the sediments and lower food web of the Salish Sea. Top predators like orcas accumulate these fat-soluble toxins in their blubber, and analyses of biopsies from southern residents show some of the highest PCB burdens recorded in any marine mammal population. That load sits relatively inert as long as a whale's fat stores remain stable. During late pregnancy and early lactation, when females metabolize blubber to support a calf, those compounds move into the bloodstream and, inevitably, into milk. Studies in the 2010s linked high PCB levels with endocrine disruption and immune problems, suggesting that the youngest members of the population may be taking the largest hit exactly when they are trying to learn how to be whales. From a cultural perspective, that means the very animals who need stable, long lives to become fluent transmitters of the dialect may instead be spending their first years fighting invisible chemistry wars waged in the 1970s. Then there is noise, the least glamorous but most literal way human infrastructure cuts into whale culture. Southern residents live in and around international shipping lanes, ferry routes, naval training areas, and one of the most recreational boat-heavy regions on the west coast. Underwater recordings in the Salish Sea show a chronic low-frequency hill in the sound spectrum from large ships, overlaid with mid-frequency buzz from fast motorboats that overlaps exactly with the 1 to 6 kHz band where many killer whale calls sit. Controlled field work by Marla Holt and colleagues, using calibrated hydrophones and digital tags attached temporarily to individual whales, found that southern residents increased their call amplitude by roughly 1 decibel for every additional decibel of background noise, a textbook Lombard effect, the same automatic, speak up, reflex humans show in a crowded bar. That helps maintain audibility at short range but shrinks the effective communication radius and costs energy. Modeling studies suggest that in heavy vessel noise, the distance over which another whale can detect a call may be cut by more than half. For an animal that relies on sound to coordinate over hundreds of meters in opaque water, each lost decibel is not a vibe, it is a smaller social world. If you want to see how these pressures become visible in daily life, watch the calendar at Harrow Strait. In the 1980s and 1990s, summer whale watchers and land-based observers could expect southern residents to appear regularly along the west side of San Juan Island from late May through September, riding the flood tide north on salmon commutes. Since roughly 2013, however, observers and organizations like the Orca Behavior Institute have logged fewer midsummer days with southern residents in those core waters and more late autumn incursions deep into Puget Sound, behavior that lines up with late chum and fall Chinook runs elsewhere. Hydrophone networks such as Orcasound, nodes at Lime Kill, Port Townsend, and Seattle, have confirmed the pattern, detecting characteristic southern resident call types near urban Seattle for weeks in some recent falls. The whales are not wandering randomly, they are following prey, as their culture tells them to do, but the map their grandmothers used is being redrawn by dam operations, hatchery policies, and climate anomalies. Listening has become both research method and public pastime. The Whale Museum's Lime Kill hydrophone stream lets anyone with an internet connection hear southern resident calls live when whales pass within a few kilometers, and Orcasound's volunteer network has turned thousands of casual listeners into an informal early warning system. In 2025, an AI model trained on years of southern resident recordings flagged an unusual cluster of high-pitched, irregular calls on a Port Townsend hydrophone, short, squeaky variants of familiar pod calls. Field biologists later confirmed that a new calf, J64, was present. The glitchy voice on the spectrogram had been a newborn practicing the family dialect before anyone had it in binoculars. That same infrastructure, applied at scale, now feeds into shipping management programs. When hydrophones detect southern resident calls near key passages, port authorities can request that nearby ships slow down, reducing both strike risk and noise levels in something close to real time. The whale's dialect has become a routing signal for container vessels and tugboats, an accidental interface between a mammal culture and global logistics. The fact that any of this exists on agency dashboards is the punchline to a long argument about why these whales matter. When the US listed the southern residents as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 2005 and Canada listed them under its Species at Risk Act in 2003, the decision was not driven by spectacular genetic divergence. Analyses of mitochondrial and nuclear DNA show that southern residents are distinct from other ecotypes, mammal-eating bigs. Whales, offshore fish-eaters, but not dramatically so, they are not a separate species. What tipped the scales was culture, a fish-eating society with a unique dialect, social structure, and movement pattern, which does not interbreed or mix socially with neighboring orca societies even when ranges overlap. Regulators created a distinct population segment, less because of DNA than because these whales behave like a separate people. Management plans now talk explicitly about protecting feeding traditions and acoustic habitat, the soundscape itself, as components of critical habitat. In 2006, NOAA designated parts of the Salish Sea as critical habitat partly on the grounds that they provide space for normal behavior, including feeding and communication, and subsequent rulemakings have tightened vessel distance rules to 300 to 400 yards or more, created seasonal, no-go, quiet zones, and framed noise reduction as essential to preserving social structure. Law, usually indifferent to dialect, is now awkwardly trying to defend one. There is a more personal version of why it matters that does not fit neatly into regulatory language. In 2018, J35, Tahlequah, gave birth to a calf that died within hours. For the next 17 days, she was observed carrying the carcass at the surface, nudging it, diving after it when it slipped away, traveling more than 1,600 kilometers in what became known worldwide as the Tour of Grief. Hydrophones in Harrow Strait and elsewhere recorded prolonged, low-frequency calls and elevated calling rates from her matroline during parts of that period, a data trace that researchers later analyzed with all the unease of people quantifying sorrow. Whether you frame that event as grief, disrupted maternal behavior, or an extreme display of social attachment, it altered the politics of the region. Washington state convened an orca task force, salmon restoration efforts gained renewed urgency, and millions of people who had never heard of J-Pod suddenly cared about vessel noise regulations. A few years earlier and a continent away, another southern resident narrative had been playing out in a concrete tank, Lolita or Tokiti, an orca captured from L-Pod in 1970 and held at the Miami Seaquarium for more than 5 decades, still produced calls that match the L-Pod dialect recorded in the wild. When analysts compared her Miami repertoire to archival L-Pod recordings, they found that key call types had persisted in her voice despite total physical isolation from her natal group. That is cultural imprinting written in decibels, a dialect learned in childhood, retained for life, and rendered useless but not erased by captivity. Even the way elders vanish shows why culture is not an ornament. J2, Granny, estimated to have been born around 1911, disappeared in late 2016 after more than 4 decades of continuous observation. She carried, in one body, nearly a century of root memory, which river mouths paid when, how to thread tidal rips that change character with storm cycles, when to linger in a particular eddy because Chinook from a specific stock are due. Acoustic logs around the time of her disappearance show subtle changes in call usage within her pod, certain group-forming calls used less frequently, timing of rally calls wobbling before settling around another older female's habits. When a matriarch dies, the dialect does not explode into chaos, but it does lose a clock. That has demographic consequences. Long-term studies in resident killer whales have shown that post-reproductive females boost the survival of their grand offspring, likely by sharing knowledge of foraging sites and perhaps by stabilizing group decisions. Killing or starving elders is not just sad, it is a mechanism for making everyone else thinner, later to reproduce, and less fluent in the protocol of being a whale. Put all of this together, the individual biographies, the prey ledger, the noise, the preserved accents in captive whales, the acoustic networks now wired into shipping policies, and why it matters, stops being a sentimental slogan and turns into a blunt management problem. Lose the southern residents, and you do not just remove some black and white bodies from a food web. You erase a specific operating manual for how to live as a fish-eating killer whale in the Salish Sea, which rivers to trust, which currents to ride, which call sequences to use when your family is spread across a kilometer of turbulent water and you need everyone to turn now. There are other killer whales elsewhere, with other diets and other dialects, but none of them can step into that role any more than a random human community can spontaneously resurrect a dead language with no surviving speakers. Conservation biologists and ethicists have started talking about cultural diversity in exactly that sense, arguing that preserving animal cultures belongs alongside preserving genetic diversity as a goal. Southern residents are one of the case studies that made that idea more than rhetoric. Back at Lime Kill, if you strip away the romance, what you are watching is a small, endangered society trying to keep its syllabus running in a noisy classroom. A calf surfaces in the lee of its mother's flank, in hydrodynamic slipstream that makes staying close cheap. The adults repeat certain call types more often than usual in the days after its birth, emphasizing the badge. Boats farther offshore either throttle down or do not, engine noise either forces everyone to raise their voices or not. Chinook either arrive on time in the rips the matriarchs remember or they do not. In the gap between do and do not lies the difference between a future in which the Salish Sea still has 3 pods whose accents you can learn in an afternoon with a hydrophone, and one in which the tapes are all that remain. The recordings will be exquisite. They will not answer when a calf calls back. To get from, "that sounds pretty," to, "that is a dialect with structure and consequences," you have to turn the inland sea into a lab without admitting it to the whales. On a July afternoon along the west side of San Juan Island, a small research skiff sits just outside the kelp line, engine off, 2 hydrophones on cables draped into Harrow Strait, and the entire human side of the operation is basically glorified plumbing, waterproof connectors, preamps in pelican cases, GPS time stamped to the second, and an observer on the bow muttering dorsal fin IDs into a handheld recorder. When J-Pod slides past, every call gets pinned to an individual or at least a matriline because somebody has already spent decades memorizing fin nicks and saddle patch shapes through the Center for Whale Research's Orca survey, which has logged every southern resident since 1976 and followed most of them from birth to death. That photo ID archive, tens of thousands of slides and digital frames tagged J1, K21, L98 and so on, gives you the who for the soundtrack the hydrophones are capturing. The Limekiln Lighthouse hydrophone, cabled to shore in the early 2000s and streaming since, adds a 24-hour baseline, so an off-duty grad student can be making pasta in Friday Harbor when their laptop suddenly fills with K-Pod calls and a Slack channel lights up. Fold in Orcasound's network of fixed hydrophones in Harrow Strait, the Port Townsend Canal, and Elliott Bay, and suddenly the Salish Sea has more continuous audio coverage than most human cities. All of that just to answer the impolite question, do these whales really have something like accents, or are we being poetic idiots? In Ford's original workflow at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo around 1980, the romance level was even lower. He took reel-to-reel tapes made in Johnston Strait and the Salish Sea, digitized them at kilohertz sample rates that now look quaint, and stared at spectrograms until patterns popped out. Discrete pulsed calls, the backbone of the dialect, show up as steep, carved contours lasting roughly half to 1.5 seconds, carrying most of their energy between 1 and 6 kHz, often emitted in stereotyped pairs. By the mid-1980s he had identified about 25 recurring shapes in southern residents alone, enough to give each an alphanumeric label, S1, S2, S3, S16, and to note which pods used which combinations. J and K shared a substantial subset, L carried several designs no one else used. You can measure the stability directly. Tapes of J-Pod recorded in the 1950s by Navy hydrophones can be reanalyzed today, and the contours overlay J-Pod's current calls with only tiny shifts in pitch or duration, noise, not change. A call type that every adult in a pod produces within a narrow tolerance band, year after year, is not improvisation, it is a learned template. At that point you're not arguing over whether there is a dialect, you're arguing over what job the dialect does. Once you have catalogued call shapes, you start asking where and when they occur, which turns the entire region into an ongoing, slightly obsessive experiment. Fixed hydrophones at Limekiln and along the Orcasound network stream audio 24 hours a day, software flags energy in the right bands, volunteers and researchers log detections. In 2022 to 2023, weeks of J-Pod calls near Seattle documented a late fall shift into central Puget Sound that matched chum salmon peaks in fisheries records, letting people map well habitat use by sound alone. In 2025, an AI classifier working off an Orcasound node near Port Townsend spat out an alert for unusual, high-pitched, irregular calls. When humans checked the stream, they realized they were probably listening to a newborn calf, eventually logged as J64, fumbling its way through the family repertoire before anyone had visual confirmation. This is the level of surveillance it takes now, not just whales present, but whales present, this pod, this family, with one voice still cracking. The same infrastructure doubles as a management tool. When Limekiln's hydrophone picks up calls, Soundwatch and state rangers get notified and can push boats back to the required 3 to 400 meter buffer before the whales hit the park's rock wall. The acoustic data set is, by accident, also a social one. You can tell which pod is where, which pods are together, and how often the chorus drops out entirely when large ships pass through. The system is non-invasive by design because the whales are listed as endangered on both sides of the border, which means the sort of brute force experiments biologists run on other animals have to be done sparingly or not at all. There was one notorious controlled playback in the early 1980s where Ford broadcast mammal-eating transient calls to fish-eating residents at a distance and watched the residents react as if someone had pulled a fire alarm. They changed direction, tightened formation, and cut their own calling, a clear sign that the wrong dialect is salient and probably frightening. Since then, ethics committees have looked at that story and basically said, great, thanks, don't do it again. So most contemporary inference comes from correlations, cross-referencing call types with behavior logged from boats or from cliffs at Limekiln, stitching audio against GPS tracks, or matching burst pulses to drone footage of a pod fanning out across a tide rip. Researchers at the Orca Behavior Institute, for instance, use standardized ethograms, checkbox lists for behaviors like tail slaps, spy hops, foraging dives, and line them up with time-stamped hydrophone recordings. If a particular S-series call repeatedly clusters in the 15 seconds before a coordinated dive, the evidence for this is part of a hunt setup doesn't come from vibes. It comes from an uncomfortable amount of spreadsheet. Digital tags add the equivalent of a helmet cam and heart monitor to the mix. Under NOAA permits, teams led by people like Marla Holt and Brad Hansen have, since the mid-2010s, occasionally approached southern residents with long poles or drones to place suction cup tags on their backs, devices that log depth, acceleration, and high-bandwidth audio for a dozen hours before popping off to be collected. Inside those files you can see a whale diving to tens of meters, echolocating with rapid clicks as it chases salmon, then emitting a loud pulsed call on the ascent, often just after a successful capture. In noisy stretches of shipping lane, those same tags record a systematic adjustment. For every decibel of additional background noise from boats, the whale increases her call amplitude by roughly a decibel, a textbook Lombard effect played out in a fjord. It works, up to a point. The call remains detectable, but the radius at which it rises above the din shrinks, and the act of shouting presumably carries a metabolic price. Quiet years during the COVID-19 slowdown provided an accidental control. Hydrophones logged lower low-frequency noise across the Salish Sea in 2020, and preliminary analyses suggest whales used a wider range of calls and called more often when the shipping lanes calmed, as if a room full of people stopped yelling and went back to conversation. The ocean, in other words, ran a before and after trial while the rest of us were baking sourdough. All this sound only matters because it hooks into something in the animals' heads. The physical machinery is familiar. Like other toothed whales, orcas produce clicks and calls by forcing air through paired phonic lips in their nasal passages. The vibrations are focused through the fatty melon in the forehead, and returning echoes are picked up by the lower jaw and transmitted to the middle ear. That system can generate everything from ultrasonic click trains for echolocation to lower frequency pulsed calls with complex modulation. The cognitive machinery is harder to map, but the learning curve leaves fingerprints on the data. In a 2006 study of resident killer whale families in British Columbia, acoustic recorders parked on the foraging grounds before and after births showed that in the days following a calf's arrival, mothers and close kin nearly doubled their use of matriline-specific call variants, as if they were over-enunciating the family name. Calf attempts, recorded on nearby hydrophones, were shorter, higher in pitch, and sloppier in contour, the vocal equivalent of a toddler saying aminal. But over the next few years those attempts converged on the adult template until, spectrographically, the youngster's calls were indistinguishable from its mother's. You do not have to anthropomorphize that sequence, you just have to admit that it looks exactly like a motor program being tuned by practice with auditory feedback, which is how songbirds, human babies, and most other vocal learners get from noise to accent. The evidence that this is learning rather than some genetically preloaded ringtone comes from every angle scientists could think of that doesn't involve unethical foster experiments. Closely related pods, J and K, for southern residents, have more similar repertoires than they do with L, which makes sense if they share an ancestor whose calls were tweaked in parallel over generations. But pods with distinct dialects spend time side by side in the same soundscape, eating the same chinook and navigating the same rock walls, and yet their call sets stubbornly refuse to converge. Northern and southern residents overlap geographically off Vancouver Island, share broad habitat acoustics, and still have zero discrete calls in common. When an adult male like L87 Onyx loses his mother and takes up permanent traveling residence with J-Pod, he remains acoustically marked as a visitor. Attentive listeners can still pick out his natal L-Pod call shapes in J-Pod traffic years later. At the far end of the spectrum, Lolita Tokiti, captured as a juvenile from L-Pod in 1970 and kept in Miami for more than half a century, was recorded making calls that match her birth community's dialect despite not having heard wild L-Pod for decades. If genes were doing the heavy lifting, you might expect subtle anatomical differences in the melon or nasal sacs to carve call structure. Instead you find whales copying foreign sounds in captivity and keeping childhood calls in the absence of reinforcement. The hypothesis that they just sound that way because of their DNA dies of lack of counterexamples. What, exactly, the whales know when they use these calls is where the arguments heat up and the data cool down. Nobody serious claims southern residents are composing sentences about the Federal Register, but it is equally hard to maintain that all this structure is just emotional static. Certain call types show up with numbing reliability in certain contexts, One motif when a spread-out group is traveling and checking in across hundreds of meters. Another when a school of salmon has just been scattered and several whales converge for the mop-up. Still others in those greeting ceremonies where two pods line up across from each other, dive, and then intermingle amid overlapping calls that sound, on a spectrogram at least, like a sudden widening of the repertoire. The correspondence is probabilistic. An S-series call that often occurs at the onset of a coordinated turn does not mean turn left, in the way a road sign does. But if you see the same pairing over and over in tag and drone data, you stop treating it as coincidence. Playback experiments with wrong dialects and with mammal-eating transients show that whales use call structure to categorize others as kin, neighbors, or dangerous strangers. That's categorical perception, at minimum. Whether any individual call carries something like a noun or a verb is an open research grant in search of better tags. Dialects sit in a broader cultural web that includes what and how these whales eat, which is where the eco-evolutionary plot gets sharp edges. Southern residents are fish specialists in a world where many orcas are not. Diet reconstructions from fish scales, fecal DNA, and stomach content show that roughly 80% of their annual energy intake historically came from adult Chinook salmon, large, fatty, predictable migrants up the Fraser, Columbia, and other rivers. Switching target species is not as simple as decide to like something new. Each prey type comes with its own distribution, escape behavior, an acoustic profile, a culture that has refined tactics, travel routes, and call usage around Chinook is, in effect, a software package optimized for one dataset. That package includes knowing which tidal rips and underwater sills concentrate salmon, how to spread the pod line abreast for a push, when to go quiet and hunt with clicks only to avoid spooking fish, and when to erupt in calls to coordinate sharing once a kill is made. You can see the cultural conservatism in the modern diet data, even after decades of Chinook decline and the presence of other fish species in the same waters. Southern residents have not diversified their menu in any major way. Biologically, that looks like a specialization that once paid off handsomely. In a damaged river system, it starts to look like a trap. The same tradition that structures feeding also shapes who breeds with whom. Southern residents form one acoustic clan, a set of pods that share some ancestral calls, but within that clan, pods are socially and acoustically distinct. Genetic work using mitochondrial haplotypes and nuclear markers shows that individuals almost never mate within their own pod. Instead, courtship and conception tend to occur during those superpod gatherings when J, K, and L mix. The dialect map overlays the pedigree map. Whales that share more calls are more closely related along maternal lines. From an evolutionary point of view, this makes dialect a plausible tool for inbreeding avoidance. If an orca can categorize prospective partners as too much like my immediate family versus from another pod but still within the clan, she gets to maintain cultural cohesion. Everyone still uses the same basic hunting traditions, while shuffling genes enough to stave off the worst of inbreeding depression. In northern residents, where multiple acoustic clans share overlapping ranges, mating is largely between clans. In the south, with only one clan, pods have to do more fine-grained sorting. That they manage at all, given a total population now hovering in the 70s, speaks to how tightly social and acoustic cues have been wired into their evolutionary strategy. Culture cuts both ways when the environment lurches. The Chinook-only software that once made southern residents superbly efficient hunters becomes a liability when river temperatures rise, snowpacks shrink, and migration windows wobble. Cascadia Research and NOAA have published blunt prey need estimates, hundreds of thousands of salmon per year just to hold the orca population more or less steady, roughly double that if you ever want to see them climb back toward 140 whales. In years when Fraser River returns are poor, hydrophone records show lower rates of long, leisurely social calling and more time spent in travel and search patterns, with click trains stretched as animals probe wider fields. At the same time, environmental noise is climbing as ship traffic increases, forcing whales to boost call amplitudes and possibly shift frequencies, which may in turn favor individuals or lineages better able to cope with chronic acoustic stress. None of this is evolution in the new species sense, it's the short-term selection of behavioral strategies within a cultural framework. A matriline led by a savvy, healthy elder who remembers alternative foraging spots and manages risk around boats might keep more calves alive through lean periods than a matriline with a less experienced leader, gradually weighting the population toward certain cultural styles. In that view, elders are not just emotional mascots, they are selectable packages of knowledge. There is an uncomfortable question lurking under all this: how flexible is the system before it snaps? Could southern residents, under extreme pressure, learn a new staple prey the way some killer whale populations worldwide shifted between seals and fish? Or is their culture too conservative to permit that within the timescale of our damage? So far, evidence points to caution bordering on stubbornness. Occasional takes of other salmon species and scattered non-tunic prey show up in diet studies, but there is no sign of a wholesale switch. Similarly, despite more frequent multipod gatherings as whales range farther in search of food, nobody hears pods blending dialects. Superpods are noisy mixtures where each matriline keeps its own call set running. The one male who changed social allegiance, L87, did not switch accents to match his new travel companions. From a cultural evolution perspective, this all suggests high resilience of tradition but low capacity for rapid innovation. That is admirable if you like continuity and a problem if the environment is changing faster than the whales are willing, or able, to rewrite their software. The conservation question then becomes brutally simple. Can we restore the conditions under which an entrenched culture continues to work, faster than the culture's rigidity turns into an extinction risk? For now, the tools on deck, photo ID, hydrophone grids, tags, genetics, AI, let us eavesdrop just enough to see that these whales are doing something more structured than making noise, and less than writing novels. They have carved acoustic badges that mark family identity, learned by calves through immersion in their mother's orbit, held stable across decades by long-lived grandmothers, and deployed in a foraging and mating system that rides on tunic calendars and a narrow social graph. They adjust their volume when we flood the sea with engines, but not enough to erase the impact. They gather in noisy, multilingual superpods without flattening their accents. They keep faith with a diet and a dialect that evolved for a different century. When you listen from the cliffs or through a laptop in a city apartment, you are effectively tapping into their nervous system, a real-time broadcast from a culture that is at once exquisitely tuned to its place and under active, measurable stress from us. Everything that follows, stories from whale watch boats, shore-based greetings, the myths humans tell about breaches and kelp games, sits on top of that machinery. The calls are the operating system, the rest is interface. All of that rigor stays a little abstract until you stand somewhere the whales turn the ocean into public radio. On a clear July evening at Lime Kill Point, the lighthouse on San Juan Island is ringed with people holding cameras, binoculars, and, increasingly, phones running the same app. The tide has just swung from ebb to flood. Down in Harrow Strait the current begins to lean north at 2 or 3 knots, pushing lines of kelp tight against the rock. 11, 12, 13 minutes later, a cluster of dorsal fins materializes low on the southern horizon. Before anyone can shout, Orcas, a speaker mounted on the lighthouse railing coughs out a burst of sound, a pair of rising-falling calls near 3 kHz, just under a second each, separated by a half-second pause. A volunteer from the Whale Museum glances at the spectrogram on a laptop, sees the contour, and says, "That's J-Pod," with the casual certainty of someone identifying a familiar neighbor's ringtone. That trick, matching a pod to its voice in real time from shore, is not magic. It's a mashup of 4 decades of call catalogs, a community hydrophone, and hundreds of listeners who have learned to hear dialect the way a birder hears a song. Formal science built the dictionary, citizen science runs the switchboard. The fixed hydrophone at Lime Kill, installed in the early 2000s by the Whale Museum, feeds audio 24 hours a day to servers where it can be graphed, archived, and, crucially, streamed to anyone with a browser. A physicist, Val Veers, and his son Scott turned that single ear into a small network, Orcasound, by wiring additional hydrophones off Port Townsend and in central Puget Sound, places where southern residents had started to appear more often in late autumn chasing chum salmon. Machine learning detectors trained on Ford's original S-series call types now monitor those streams for the acoustic signatures of J, K, and L pods, pinging volunteers when a pattern matches. In September 2025, a Port Townsend node picked up a string of unusually high-pitched, wobbly calls layered over standard J-pod motifs. Within minutes, Orcasound's system pushed an alert, and land-based observers wrote, "New calf," in their notebooks before anyone had seen the animal. When the Center for Whale Research confirmed the arrival of J64 days later from photo ID, the AI had already done the cultural version of texting a birth announcement. If you're standing on the rocks with no background, your first impulse is to treat the speaker as a soundtrack. Whales approach, speaker makes whooping noises, everyone cries. The more hours you log, the more the sounds separate into functions. Long, evenly spaced contact calls roll out when the pod is strung in a line over several hundred meters, each whale 2 or 3 body lengths from the next, using sound to keep track of bodies in murky, 10-meter visibility water. Rapid-fire bursts cluster when the group tightens near a tide rip and salmon scales begin to glitter at the surface. Some afternoons the stream is almost non-stop chatter, others, you get 20 minutes of black fins surfing past in silence broken only by exhalations loud enough to hear on shore. Regulars at Limekill learn the rule that took DTAGs and spectrograms to formalize. Noise and behavior explain that silence, not mood. When whales spread out to forage, or when they slip under the path of ferries and tugs, they switch to narrowband echolocation clicks and slash their use of broadband social calls. When the water and shipping lanes go quiet, call levels and rates drop because there is nobody to shout over. At some point, someone next to you will say, they talk louder when the whale watch boats arrive. Annoyingly, that is true in a way that is even less romantic than it sounds. Marla Holt's team at NOAA has documented a clear Lombard effect in southern residents. For every decibel that vessel noise raises the background, the whales boost their call amplitude by roughly 1 decibel, up to the limits of what their sacs and muscles can manage. DTAGs stuck on dorsal fins for 12 to 24-hour bursts record those calls from inches away and match them to automatic identification system ship tracks and hydrophone noise levels. The scaling law shows up as a slope on a regression line long before it becomes a conservation poster. On the bluff, you experience it as an abrupt change in vibe. A container ship grinds past at 15 knots, the background fills with a low-frequency rumble, and the next series of calls from JPod registers as audibly harsher and louder even through cheap speakers. The signage that asks boaters to slow down or stay 400 yards off is not aesthetic. It is an attempt to stop turning every family conversation into a shouted phone call in a nightclub. The informal record of all this is messy, biased, and unexpectedly useful. Naturalist guides on tour boats keep notebooks dense with phrases like, very vocal today, or, silent despite fish jumping, tight to tide state and rough estimates of group size. Fisheries crews in Puget Sound in the 1980s already had folk rules, noisy whales, lots of Chinook, quiet whales, Chinook scarce, long before prey sampling and fecal DNA analysis backed up the idea that southern residents call more when salmon are plentiful enough that they can afford to socialize while eating, and drop into radio silence when they are scraping for calories. These logs don't substitute for formal epigrams, but they point researchers toward questions. Why did the whales go quiet on a day with no obvious ships? Why did a particular calling bout line up with a known chum pulse? Citizen reports submitted to Orca Network or Orca Sound, timestamped notes that calls heard at 22:15, lots of squeals, now feed straight into datasets that test and refine automated detectors. A listener with no degree, sitting up late with headphones, is effectively labeling training data. From the whale's point of view, the human layer is just background clutter with the occasional dangerous propeller. From our point of view, the whales have become local celebrities with a fan base meticulous enough to embarrass many pop stars. The Whale Museum's Orca Adoption Program, launched in the 1980s, turned Balcom's ID catalog into something approximating a family album, each whale with a number, J1, J2, K21, and a colloquial name like Ruffles, Granny, or Cappuccino, plus a short biography and a list of relatives. Schoolchildren in Seattle and Vancouver sent in pocket money to adopt a whale and got back updates when it was seen, who it traveled with, and, increasingly, what its calls looked like on a spectrogram. The same museum's live hydrophone feed made it possible for an adopted whale to phone home. A classroom might pull up the stream and listen for the distinctive doublet calls known to be common in that family's repertoire. A behavior that started as an entry in a DFO technical report, call S1, duration 0.8 seconds, dominant frequency 2.8 kHz, became, in the public imagination, Granny's hello. The science did not change, the framing did. Every ecosystem comes with myths, and the Salish Sea is no exception. Spend enough time on docks and you'll hear that orcas love classical music, usually attributed to a single viral incident, a musician lowering a hydrophone and playing cello or flute through speakers as JPod cruised by. The whales approached, changed direction a little, surfaced close, and the story hardened into, they are connoisseurs of bark. The data version is boring in a way that preserves their dignity. Orcas have exquisitely sensitive hearing from a few hundred hertz up into tens of kilohertz. Any broadband, continuous sound pumped into their environment will register as something new over there. It is hardly shocking that a family of curious, social predators might investigate an unfamiliar localized noise source the way they investigate a new boat engine. Formal spectrograms from such episodes, when anyone remembered to record, do not show new call types, or sustained shifts in repertoire. Call rates often drop, which is exactly what you would expect if you were trying to parse a strange sound rather than yell over it. They like the music, is folk shorthand for, they noticed we were making noise. Some myths are harmless, others need a firm nudge. Popular articles and social media posts regularly announce that Orcas have a language as complex as ours, complete with speculative lexicons claiming that such and such call means, come here, or, I found a fish. Researchers tend to respond by quietly rolling out numbers instead of adjectives. Call catalogs for southern residents list around 30 discrete call types shared community-wide, with each pod using a subset and introducing small variants. Playback experiments in the early 1980s demonstrated that residents can discriminate their own dialect from that of mammal-eating, transient Orcas, responding to the latter with agitation and avoidance, so identity coding is real. But nobody has discovered a one-to-one mapping between specific calls and abstract reference the way human words work. The sober description, stereotyped, socially learned calls with probabilistic associations to contexts like travel, social milling, and prey capture, doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, so the public defaults to language. In practice, the difference is mostly about humility. Saying, they have dialects and family badges, keeps us honest about what we actually measured. One of the few myths that survived scientific scrutiny mostly intact involves ghosts of a sort, the idea that a whale can carry its accent for life even when nobody around it speaks the same way. Lolita, also known by her L-Pod ID, Tokiti, was taken from the southern resident community in 1970 during the capture era, shipped to Miami, and kept in a concrete tank for more than 5 decades. Trainers and visitors noticed for years that her calls sounded different from the other captive Orcas, most of whom came from North Atlantic or Icelandic populations. In the late 1990s and again in 2018, bioacousticians dug out old recordings of her tank vocalizations and ran spectrograms against Ford's L-Pod catalog. The match was unnervingly tight. Contours, durations, and frequency sweeps lined up with L-Pod call types recorded in the wild off Washington and British Columbia, while showing little resemblance to the repertoires of her tank mates. What activists described as calling for her family translates in technical language to retention of natal dialect in isolation, but the underlying fact is the same. A calf who learned her calls from a particular matriline in the late 1960s in the Salish Sea was still producing them, years later, in Florida, to no one who understood. Lolita's story sits near the border between science and legend because it has been taken up so strongly by the Lummi Nation and other Coast Salish peoples, who have long described Cuahulmeshan, Orcas, as kin with their own songs and family territories. When the possibility of returning her to a sea pen in her home waters was seriously discussed in the early 2020s, tribal leaders referred to her as a relative who remembered her songs despite forced exile. That framing is not in conflict with the acoustic analysis, it simply embeds it in a different grammar. Long before Western biologists strung hydrophones along Harrow Strait, indigenous stories along this coast talked about killer whales traveling in stable groups, responding to drum rhythms, and having distinct voices that could be recognized at a distance. Modern collaborations, like Dialect tribes researchers placing passive recorders in historically important channels and comparing the resulting call patterns to seasonal movements described in oral history, are beginning to braid those narrative chronologies with the time series in our databases. It is one thing for a scientist to say, dialects correlate with matrilineal genealogies. It is another for a community to point to a passing pod and say, in their own language, our relatives are singing. Even if you ignore the stories and just watch the behavior, the whales seem determined to produce scenes that look like ritual. When two southern resident pods that have been traveling separately for days converge in Harrow Strait, they often assemble into what researchers blandly call a greeting ceremony. The stereophonic version from the Lime Kill hydrophone is better theatre than the surface view. 15 or 20 minutes before you can see more than distant blows, the stream fills with overlapping clan signature calls and pod-specific variants used at higher than baseline rates. Visual observers describe the pods lining up abreast, a few body lengths apart, then accelerating toward each other, passing through, and dissolving into a riot of breaches, tail slaps, and close mingling. John Ford and others have pointed out that these sequences tend to occur where channel geometry forces traffic into a narrower corridor, a place you would want to coordinate anyway. The spectacle is therefore doing double duty, social reaffirmation and logistics. Tourists near the lighthouse talk about whale church. Spectrograms show a spike in a handful of call types associated with high arousal and group cohesion. Both accounts are incomplete without the other. Of course, where there is ritual, there is slapstick. One of the most endearing ways dialect shows up to a casual listener is in calf mistakes. In the days and weeks after a birth, adults in the matriline repeat their family signature calls more frequently and, in some cases, produce slower, slightly distorted versions, as if stretching the syllables for a novice ear. Newborns answer with shriller, truncated attempts that barely resemble the target contour. On an Orca sound spectrogram, those appear as little diagonal smears riding on top of adults' tidy, blocky motifs. Volunteers monitoring the streams have learned to spot the pattern. A sudden uptick in squeaky intrusions layered over a familiar pod's calls often prompts excited chat messages long before photo ID teams get confirmation. The comedy is in the mismatch. A call that, in an adult, lines up perfectly with pod timing comes out of a calf as something closer to a kazoo played through a snorkel. The only reason we can laugh at it is that, by the end of that calf's second or third year, the smears have snapped into line. The joke is temporary motor chaos on the way to a stable cultural template. Humans add their own unintentional humor to the mix. Stand on a whale watch deck and listen to the narration the first time a hydrophone goes over the side. Guides, who know perfectly well that call S16 has no published translation, will still say things like, they're telling each other there's salmon here, or, they're calling the others to join the party, partly because that is how you keep a boat full of motion-sick tourists engaged, and partly because, functionally, it is not far wrong. When you later align those same calls with drone footage, you often see the smokers in the data, group members converging on a successful hunter, calves jockeying for position near adults, the pack tightening. The words, hey, dinner, never appear in a paper, but the calls that laypeople treat as such do show up with statistically elevated frequency after prey capture. The funny part is that reality sometimes outpaces restraint. A naturalist might say, they're greeting old friends. The spectrogram will show a burst of exactly the call types Ford's work associates with pod reunions. The human explanation is fuzzy, the timing is not. Then there are the misfires, the moments when an animal appears to push a cultural button at the wrong time. In one well-documented case, a juvenile male in J-pod, logged by observers who knew his dorsal fin and by hydrophones that caught his voice, produced an excited rally-type call while the rest of his family were milling lazily near Lime Kill in flat water. No obvious prey and no other pods incoming. Nothing happened, no one sped up, the call sequence fizzled. You can almost script the caption, teenager tries to start party, nobody bites. Across the season, his call usage converged on the norms of his matroline, with rally calls clustering more around actual travel and regrouping events. Learning, in other words, involves a period when whales, like us, occasionally shout the acoustic equivalent of road trip, in the middle of a nap. That is a joke only because there is a background template for, when this is appropriate, passed down from elders who rarely waste breath. If you pull back even farther, the funniest part of the Southern resident story is how quickly humans decided we could learn to speak whale, and how stubbornly the whales refused to collaborate in that fantasy. The Orca karaoke phase comes for many new enthusiasts. They listen to Lime Kill stream, hear the warbling calls, and try to reproduce them with their own voices, whistling or ululating into the air. If you were to record those attempts and lay them on a spectrogram beside J-pod's calls, as some patient educators have indeed done at outreach events, the differences are comical. Human imitations wobble in both pitch and timing, harmonics smear, durations vary wildly. The whale's calls, by contrast, stack into narrow, nearly identical bands, like a machine code. The exercise is more than a party trick. It viscerally demonstrates how exacting the cultural standard is inside a pod and how many hours of practice a calf must log to hit that standard. Our failures are the control group. The whale's success is the phenomenon. All of these informal scraps, folk rules about noisy whales and good fishing, classroom adoptions, cellists with waterproof speakers, tribal stories about relatives who sing, would be footnotes if they didn't converge on the same physical reality that the hydrophones and tags describe. Southern residents live in a soundscape that they have carved into categories. This set of contours marks our family, this cluster accompanies travel, this spike means we are together and excited, this long gap means searching, hush. People on shore and in boats, people listening over laptops thousands of kilometers away, and people whose ancestors watched these same channels from cedar canoes are all, in their own ways, learning to read those categories. The whales did not evolve their culture for us. But the fact that we can hitch a ride on it, from a bluff at Lime Kill, a living room tuned to Orca sound, or a community that has called them QI Holmeshan for generations, is the bridge that makes the next questions unavoidable. What happens to a dialect when the speakers go silent, and what, exactly, are we willing to change so that this inland sea keeps its chorus? The hardest parts of this story aren't the graphs, they're the scenes where the graphs go quiet and everyone listens anyway. In July 2018, J35, Tahlequah, gave birth to a calf that died minutes after it surfaced. That should have been the end of the dataset, one failed birth, one more line in a mortality table. Instead, Crews on the west side of San Juan Island watched her balance the calf's body on her rostrum, lose it, dive for it, and bring it back up again, repeating that cycle for at least 17 days and roughly 1,600 kilometers of travel. Boat-based observers logged group composition and distance every few minutes. Limekiln and Orca sound hydrophones recorded the soundscape, periods of tight cluster, low-speed travel, and bouts of calls that naturalists described as longer, more frequent, and raw. Later, acousticians went back through the tapes and did the unromantic work, classifying each vocalization as a known discrete call type, measuring durations and peak frequencies. Nothing new appeared. There was no special grief call hiding outside the catalogue. The repertoire was standard, the rates were not. Family signature calls and contact calls spiked when the group tightened around her and dropped when she drifted slightly apart. An oscillation of cohesion around a mother who refused to let go. That's the part people misunderstand about science and sentiment. The public heard wailing, the spectrogram showed familiar contours at unusual tempos and densities. The difference doesn't cancel the grief, it pins it to coordinates. When Washington State convened an Orca task force later that year, 50-odd stakeholders arguing about dam removal, fishing quotas, and vessel rules, they did not cite sadness in their technical documents. They cited calf survival rates, body condition data from drones, and the simple arithmetic that a population at roughly 72 animals in 2020, down from 97 in 1996 and about 100 before the capture era, cannot afford to lose many more newborns. But everyone in the room had seen the footage of Tahlequah and, if they worked hydrophonically, had the sound of that month burned into their heads. The emotion did not replace the numbers, it chose which numbers got political traction. A different kind of heartbreak played out in a concrete tank 3 time zones away. In 1970, a southern resident yearling from El Pod was captured in Penn Cove and shipped to Miami. She ended up with the stage name Lolita and, later, the name Tokiti given by Coast Salish people who had watched her family for generations. For decades she was the only captive southern resident left alive. In the 1990s, acoustic analyst Margaret Garvey took recordings of her tank calls and compared them to archival El Pod recordings from the 1970s and 80s. Her conclusion was the sort of sentence that makes you sit down. The contours and pulse structure of Tokiti's most common calls matched the El Pod dialect closely enough to assign them to specific call types. 50 years after her abduction, she was still speaking the family language in a place where nobody answered. When Lummi elders referred to her as a whale who remembered her songs and campaigned to bring her home to a sea pen in the Salish Sea, they were not being metaphorical, they were describing a measurable cultural retention that outlasted half a century of isolation. She died in 2023, before that experiment could happen. Somewhere in an archive, her Miami calls and her family's wild calls sit on adjacent hard drives, a split screen of a culture that persisted and a body that could not. Between those extremes, one mother surrounded by her clan in a noisy inland sea, one elder stranded with stadium speakers, are quieter cases that matter just as much for understanding what loss means in a matrilineal acoustic society. In 2001, L98, Luna, a young southern resident male from El Pod, became separated from his family and settled in Nootka Sound off Vancouver Island, hundreds of kilometers from his natal range. Boat owners in the area remember him as the friendly whale who rubbed against hulls and followed tugs. DFO researchers remember a calf that had misplaced his social network and was trying to rebuild it with whatever large, noisy objects were available. His calls, recorded in Nootka, matched the El Pod dialect he grew up with rather than the transient or offshore orcas that occasionally passed through the region, proof that geographic displacement did not erase his acoustic identity. He died in 2006, killed by a tugboat propeller. The official reports talk about collision risk and management failures. The subtext is that a young male whose entire culture told him, stay with someone, ended up gluing himself to machinery because we removed the people he was supposed to shadow. It's tempting, in the face of stories like that, to retreat into abstraction, culture loss, social disruption, clean phrases with no teeth. But the poignant part from the whale's point of view is mechanical. A calf born into J-Pod today inherits a package of expectations, that contact calls from a particular matriline mean safety, that certain discrete call pairs precede fish sharing, that greeting ceremony cascades will happen when pods reunite after days apart. Those expectations are built from thousands of hours spent within one body length of a mother whose calls and movements are tightly correlated. The calf's nervous system literally calibrates itself to those contour context pairings. Remove the mother, or the grandmother who anchors the travel routes, and you don't just erase affection, you erase the scoreboard that tells a juvenile whether the day is going according to plan. When conservationists talk about Protecting social structure, this is what they mean. Preserving the elder cohort so that a calf's mental model of how the world should sound doesn't collapse halfway through adolescence. If that all sounds unbearably earnest, the universe obligingly supplies some completely unhinged plot twists. One of the cleanest, "You have got to be kidding," results in this field sits in a filing cabinet at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Recordings of J-Pod from the 1950s, made on analog gear that predates some of your parents, lined up against digital recordings from the 2000s. The spectrograms match to a degree that would make a forensic linguist suspicious if they didn't know better. Same S1 and S2 contours, same durations within human error, same preference for certain cool pairings in travel versus milling. John Ford and colleagues quantified that stability in the early 1990s and have been updating the catalogues ever since. It is now routine to say that Southern resident dialects have changed only minimally over at least 70 years. The unbelievable part is not just the time span, it's that this tradition survived while we were throwing down projects, PCB, laced effluent, and an entire whale capture industry at the same population. We rewrote the river hydrograph and the Orcas kept their verbs. Then there's the day in 2022 when a hydrophone off California heard ghosts from the north. Orca Sounds Network, built to listen in Harrow Strait and adjacent waters, had already taught West Coast nerds to recognize the general timbre of southern resident calls. In September of that year, a separate listening station far to the south logged pulsed calls that didn't match local mammal-eating Biggs whales. When analysts ran the clips against southern resident catalogues, the fingerprints lined up with an L-pod subgroup, call types, sequences, and timing patterns matched their known repertoire closely enough that the team could say, with a straight face, "We are hearing southern resident L-pod off California, more than 800 kilometers from their usual summer haunts." No other orcas were reported visually in the area. No other population shares those discrete calls. The whales were apparently chasing late-running Chinook down the coast, extending their cultural map of where salmon used to be into a part of the Pacific we did not associate with them. To someone staring at the spectrogram, it was like having your grandmother phone you from a different continent without warning. Humans have now been listening long enough that machines are starting to beat us to the punchlines. By the late 2010s, projects like Orca Sounds Live Detector, built with Microsoft engineers, were feeding live hydrophone streams into convolutional neural networks trained on labeled calls. The algorithms got good enough to send text alerts, southern resident call detected, with latencies measured in seconds. In one widely shared case, Orca Conservancy staff received an automated ping flagging an odd, high-pitched, truncated version of a common S-call. Field teams later identified a brand new calf, J64, traveling with its mother in the same encounter. The child had effectively announced itself to a server farm by mispronouncing the family password. There is something wonderfully absurd about a species whose culture nearly killed these whales: industrial shipping, fossil fuel noise, now training digital ears to listen for babies mangling their first syllables. All of this romantic sci-fi would be easier to enjoy if the baseline numbers weren't so grim. The southern residents are officially listed as endangered in both Canada and the US, under the Species at Risk Act since 2003 and the Endangered Species Act since 2005, not because their DNA is tragically quirky, but because their culture and ecology make them a discrete, non-replaceable unit. Historically, this community held around 100 whales in the 1960s. Live captures for marine parks removed roughly 47 individuals, dropping the count to 71 by 1974. Partial recovery brought the population to 97 by 1996. Since then it has slid back to the low to mid-70s, with calf births and losses tracked like a heartbeat on the Center for Whale Research's website. The threats are a tedious trifecta: Chinook salmon runs that have been hammered by dams and habitat loss, persistent organic pollutants like PCBs that bioaccumulate in blubber and get dumped into calves during nursing, and underwater noise from shipping, ferries, and whale watch boats that forces whales to shout, compressing the margin in an already tight energy budget. Marla Holt's work in 2009 quantified the Lombard effect here. For every decibel of extra vessel noise, these orcas raise their call level by about a decibel. That keeps calls audible but shrinks the range at which quiet cues, short contact grunts before a prey handoff, say, can travel. The "is it changing?" question sits right in the crosshairs of that stress. We know the dialects are robust, we also know they are being asked to operate in a different ocean than the one their founders knew. Comparisons of call structure between the 1970s and 2000s suggest slight upward shifts in frequency in some call types, plausibly because calling in a noisier low-frequency environment selects for whistles that sit a bit higher in the band where masking is less severe. Tag studies with digital recorders have shown that whales call less when vessels are extremely close and during certain kinds of foraging, especially at night when quiet might help them eavesdrop on salmon or avoid broadcasting their position to prey. COVID-19's 2020 shipping slowdown provided a natural experiment. Automatic detectors logged lower background noise in the Salish Sea and, in some stretches, broader call audibility as whales regained meters of communication range simply because container schedules hiccuped. We do not yet have a full before and after dialect analysis for that period, but the pattern echoes what urban bird researchers saw during the same months. When humans shut up, animals reverted to a richer, lower-effort version of their own culture almost immediately. If you're hoping for a neat forecast curve, the whales refuse to cooperate. On one hand, their acoustic traditions appear extraordinarily conservative. This community has specialized on salmon for at least half a century of observation and likely much longer. They have not pivoted to marine mammal hunting even as Chinook returns have sagged. Their dialects have stayed within a few % of their ancestral shapes. Their social system still hinges on matrilines that keep offspring for life, with females sometimes living into their 80s as walking, swimming, repositories of route maps and call timing. On the other hand, the environment that's selected for that stubbornness is changing faster than any matriarch can narrate. Climate-driven shifts in river temperature and flow, changing ocean conditions for salmon, and accumulating contaminants all nibble at the carrying capacity from different angles. Management agencies have, somewhat miraculously, started treating culture itself as a thing you can fail to conserve. The IUCN and national bodies now talk about culturally significant units, and southern residents are held up in white papers as a textbook case, a small, demographically vulnerable community whose diet and dialect are both learned and unique. Recovery plans now include goals that sound suspiciously like a sociology syllabus. Maintain opportunities for normal foraging and social behaviors, avoid changes in noise levels that would interfere with communication, protect elders because they carry institutional memory. Washington state has implemented 300 to 400 yard standoff distances for most vessels, added mandatory go-slow zones in core habitat, and experimented with dynamic, well warning, systems that use live acoustics and AIS ship tracks to nudge captains out of the way. Real-time hydrophone data now feeds into apps that flash messages like, Southern residents present, slow to 7 knots, a feedback loop in which whale zone calls become the trigger for making the sea slightly more habitable for them. The future, if these measures work, will not look like a Disney ending, it will look like a society that stays weird in a landscape that stops getting worse. Imagine, 2 or 3 decades from now, a summer where the population has inched back into triple digits, not a boom, just enough whales that an entire generation has never known what it is to have only 70 neighbors. By then, some of the calves listening today under their mother's flanks will be matriarchs themselves, still using about 30 shared clan calls and a dozen pod-specific ones, the acoustic equivalent of keeping the same flag while repainting the harbor. Hydrophone networks, by then cheap and ubiquitous, will provide the background soundtrack for ferry commuters and school kids who can pull up a real-time spectrogram on their phones and say, with irritating twin confidence, "That's K-Pod." You can tell from the S16 variants. In that version of the story, what we saved was not just a head count, it was a pattern. The whales will still be salmon specialists because we made sure there was salmon to be special about. Their dialects will still differ from their northern resident cousins because we didn't compress everyone into one stressed-out remnant pod. Greeting ceremonies will still sound like a small riot because there will still be multiple pods to greet. The social learning mechanisms we've talked about, mothers exaggerating family calls for newborns, grandmothers smoothing out timing errors, adolescents practicing until their squeaks fall into line, will still be doing their quiet, repetitive work in a sea that is busy but not deafening. And if we blow it, then sometime in the next half-century, a hydrophone will go dead for reasons that are purely mundane, budget cuts, corrosion, neglect, and nobody will rush to fix it because there is nothing left to hear. The spectrogram will flatten to ship noise and rain. The most sophisticated AI in the world will sit on petabytes of archival data and find no new calls to classify. The loss will not be a single charismatic animal or a photogenic calf, it will be a set of habits, an accent, a way of folding information into sound that took centuries to assemble and a few bad decades to erase. The uncomfortable, hopeful truth is that which branch we end up on is not a mystery of whale psychology but a function of salmon management, shipping policy, and how seriously we take the idea that non-human cultures exist and are worth the paperwork. Southern resident Orcas have already done the hard part. They built a durable language of sorts, welded it to a cooperative hunting style, and kept both stable through a human century that has not exactly been gentle. Our part is embarrassingly prosaic by comparison. We have to put more fish in the water, fewer toxins in the food chain, and less noise between a grandmother and a calf trying to hear her. If we manage that, then on some future August flood in Harrow Strait, another file of dorsals will come past Lime Kill, another pair of pulsed calls will mark time over the rocks, and somewhere in that chorus a young whale will get its family badge exactly right on the first try. We will not be there in its head to celebrate. But the fact that nobody will notice, that it will just sound like the sea remembering itself, will be the loudest measure of success.